here tonight to suggest very, very strongly that many of the illnesses that afflict us today in ever-growing numbers and severity were hatched in biological warfare laboratories and have now escaped, whether intentionally or accidentally, and are now among us today.
Never stop to wonder when watching my TV why we who do the work so seldom see. Now I'm wondering why we're blacked out or portrayed as troublemakers, or always in the background when on screen. Working TV, now we're on screen. Working TV.
Welcome to Working TV. I'm Libby Davies. If you believed that aircraft with secret government approval have been spraying noxious chemicals developed in U.S. military biological warfare laboratories on unsuspecting Canadians, would you be paranoid? Or if you yourself saw distinct plumes of chemtrails from this spraying, yet were told by Transport Canada that no such spraying was taking place, would you be delusional? You'd be absolutely correct, according to William Thomas, who has spent the last 14 months studying the chemtrails phenomenon. He's an award-winning journalist who recently wrote a book about the Gulf War syndrome. This is the strange cluster of illnesses all linked to a deterioration of the autoimmune system suffered by troops who received anthrax immunization before being deployed in the Gulf War. It's a lot like the chemtrail syndrome. Perhaps Thomas is a fraud. Perhaps his photographs and videotape evidence are all fakes. We don't know for sure, and the mainstream media won't touch his story. Nevertheless, we're told that Project Censored USA, a respected media watchdog group, recently judged chemtrails to be one of the most underreported stories of the past year. So you be the judge. Here now is William Thomas on chemtrails.
My story really began on the battlefields of Kuwait, just after the Gulf War, just after liberation, when I entered that town and joined up with two other gentlemen in a Gulf Environmental Emergency Response team. And the three of us were the sole response to the biggest environmental disaster of modern time, including an oil slick 25 times bigger than Exxon Valdez, a slick that was later doubled in size by the oil rain falling out of that sky. We didn't see the sun our entire time in Kuwait. I was focused on the environmental aspects of that war, but when I came home from that conflict, I was very ill for a year. I had no functioning immune system. I would get the flu and it would linger for months and months and then return. And through a program of superb vitamin supplementation, Dr. Matson here in this town, I was able to regain my health and my immune system. And when I heard from hundreds and hundreds of veterans about a strange illness they were calling Gulf War syndrome, I became very concerned as a journalist that, again, this was not being covered by the mainstream press. And in 12 months of going every news source from Rolling Stone and Mother Jones to the New York Times, I was turned down everywhere because the story was simply too hot. That story on Gulf War illness was eventually published by Monday Magazine in Victoria, and I went on to write a book called Bringing the War Home. And in that book, I was able to show a photograph of a very tiny critter, about the tenth of the size of bacteria, called a mycoplasma, which Dr. Garth Nicholson and his wife Nancy, foremost microbiologists with reputations highly regarded throughout the world in their profession, had tracked Gulf War illness to this mycoplasma in the anthrax vaccines given to Canadian, American, Australian, and British soldiers. Many of them got sick even though they never deployed to the Gulf. And I concluded the book by saying the only good news is with some 200,000 sick veterans in North America and their spouses and their children, at least the mycoplasma and these biological weapons are not loose among the public. I was wrong. So tonight we're going to have a look at what is really ailing us. We're going to have a look at what is happening in the skies overhead, and we're going to talk about what we can do about that. In January 1999, I got a phone call from the managing editor of the Environment News Service, whom I worked for in the Gulf, and he said, please check out a story of a man named William Wallace, just over the border in Washington State, who lives in eastern Washington, very remote region. He lives in a cabin with his wife. And Mr. Wallace has been talking about large airplanes overflying his house back and forth, spraying plumes that look like contrails, the condensation trails we're all used to seeing. But unlike these ice crystal trails that form in the hot engines of jet aircraft above 33,000 feet, according to the U.S. military and Canadian aviation authorities, unlike these condensation trails that linger usually, not always, but almost always, for about 30 to 45 seconds. You see the pencil-thin trail a short distance behind the aircraft, disappearing like the wake behind a boat. Unlike these trails, the trails that William Wallace and his wife Anne were seeing were broad white plumes. They lingered for hours. And as these aircraft began crisscrossing each other and forming a grid, these plumes gathered together and took a clear blue sky and made it opaque, hazy, milky. Temperatures dropped. His animals sickened, his dogs died, his plants sickened, his wife became very ill. And when I went on Art Bell for the first time and used William Wallace's name with his permission, he was again visited for the third time by aircraft who sprayed their property. In fact, that night when I finished my first Art Bell show, I was living in a small cabin in the hills outside of Chemainus. And I came outside about 3:30 in the morning, very wired from this very intense presentation. Took a breath of air, beautiful night, stars, just started to relax, and I froze. Giant X right over the cabin. Now, I'm not paranoid or anything. But when they started flying parallel patterns down the ridge right across from me over the next few weeks, I began to wonder. If maybe some people were sensitive about having this story exposed. Let's have a quick look at what we're talking about, because pictures are always better than words. I don't know about you, but people continually tell me, oh, these are normal contrails, these are normal aircraft patterns, and I'm here to tell you tonight that if commercial airline pilots pulled this stunt, they would lose their license. Yeah. These pictures were taken very recently over Nevada, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and International Flight Center, and towards the end, Vancouver on Monday of this week. Legal spacing for commercial airliners is 3 miles. I believe the X's are for satellite identification. Don't worry, it's just normal airline traffic. And if you wait a few minutes, you'll watch and see these chemtrails start to spread out as they're doing here. And if you have ignored the phenomena for an hour and happen to look up, you'll probably think it's just clouds. But fog forms at ground level. It doesn't form at 20,000 feet. But something else was going on. Something else down here on the ground. Last winter, in this city, in Victoria, in London, Ontario, in Toronto, Edmonton, cities across Canada, we saw an epidemic of influenza-like illnesses. That epidemic was also right across the United States and England. At Peterborough, the emergency room took 307 acute care patients in one day. In England, refrigerator trucks were hired to haul the dead bodies away. This is from the BBC, by the way. This is an exact repeat of the previous winter, when refrigerator trucks were pushed into service at morgues in England. And we had 12 straight weeks of what the Centers for Disease Control called an epidemic of influenza-like illness and pneumonia, an epidemic in terms of death rates. England saw 8,200 people die in 3 weeks, mostly the elderly. This year, we looked at 19 of 20 weeks, epidemic levels, influenza-like illness, double pneumonia, and death. The CDC called it the flu. Most of the media we received called it the flu. I'm here tonight to tell you it was not the flu. In fact, many doctors were echoing the words of one nurse supervisor who said, "I don't think anyone knows what's causing this sickness." Doctors were saying this to the New York Times. And unlike flu that takes time to spread through a population, these illnesses were appearing virtually overnight in neighborhoods, communities, and cities, swamping hospital wards. And what the media never remarked on was that the incident of heavy spraying, the characteristic exits, the gel falling on parked cars and windshields and buildings, took place always at the same time, and within 24 to 48 hours, we saw these outbreaks of illness. Yes, some of it was the flu, but very little of it was influenza. The medical director for the Via Christi Regional Medical Center said, he told reporters, "This thing kills even healthy people in 4 to 5 days, and I have a stack of emails of aunts and uncles and family members who suddenly contracted pneumonia, although in good health, and were dead within a week." But when the WHO and the National Respiratory and Enteric Virus Surveillance Lab tested more than 18,000 people since last October, they found that 13% tested positive for influenza, the national average during an epidemic. In some areas, the peak, they tested 33% positive. Again, the national average was down around 13%. Reporters asked the CDC, "What is this?" And they said, "This illness could be due to some other pathogen." And when I looked at the heavy spray days by city, I again got an exact correlation. No, I do not have scientific proof, scientific evidence, but folks were way beyond coincidence here.
I'm Noam Chomsky. You're watching Working TV.
And as I followed leads from Mr. Wallace and started contacting people across the United States, I ran into meningitis outbreaks in the wake of this strain. This has been a rare inflammation of the brain and spinal cord, and comes on with flu-like symptoms, a skin rash, a stiff neck, severe headaches. And you know, we're still running into those symptoms after heavy spray days in schools and communities across North America. In Bell River, just outside of Windsor, there were 3 cases and 1 death among 3,000 people, and they vaccinated everyone. Multiple sclerosis started showing up. Chronic fatigue has been a major component linked to the spraying, as well as lupus outbreaks in Oklahoma, Kansas City, Florida, other locations in the wake of heavy spraying. And then this came up, transverse myelitis, something so rare, we rarely see it, and yet at the Cedars-Sinai Hospital in LA, 8 cases in 2 weeks after heavy spraying there. Hit people, pets, goats, other animals. So what do we we have here? Well, we have a worsening epidemic over the past 2 years of a flu-like illness that has not been identified, a flu that is not the flu. We have, according to the CDC, an epidemic of death from influenza-like illness, pneumonia, and cardiac arrest. Now, since when is cardiac arrest a symptom of the flu? But that's what the CDC is reporting. And I've been the reporter and a columnist dealing with alternative health issues for years, and I have wondered at the sudden upsurge and predominance of autoimmune type diseases. We just mentioned a few: chronic fatigue, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. Virtually overnight in the past few decades. Yes, our immune systems are under increasing attack, but I believe we are under other attack as well. I got back in touch with Dr. Garth Nicholson, and he told me that now he believes that if we look behind chronic fatigue, multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus, in many cases, we are going to find mycoplasma, because that's exactly what he is finding, and he's also finding brucellosis. Well, as Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again, because it took me right back to my research for bringing the war home and my research into biological warfare and Gulf War illness. And I'm here tonight to suggest very, very strongly that many of the illnesses that afflict us today in ever-growing numbers and severity were hatched in biological warfare laboratories and have now escaped, whether intentionally or accidentally, and are now among us today. I'll have some good news in a while, I promise. But let's follow this line of inquiry. Brucellosis developed as an aerosol during World War II at Fort Detrick, premier biowarfare lab on this planet. I talked to Don Scott, the author of the Brucellosis Triangle, and he had discovered that they were able to extract the active agent from brucellosis, discard the rest of the bacteria, so that when people got sick from this, doctors went in and they couldn't find the bacteria. This is genetic engineering at its most diabolical. This brucellosis was put in burster bombs and exploded over North Korea during the Korean War, and a plague did break out. Read a higher form of killing, if you can find that book, and it documents what happened. But then look at this. Soldiers at that time who were working in chemical biological warfare were given disability compensation if they contracted a certain disease within 2 years of discharge. What was that disease? Multiple sclerosis. Don Scott says that he believes chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia are brucellosis derived. I noted in Bringing the War Home that from 1985 to 89, brucellosis was among the shipment of germ warfare cultures shipped from the American Type Culture Corporation in Maryland, near Fort Detrick, to someone named Saddam Hussein. And in fact, it was the United States who armed Saddam Hussein with the chemical and biological weapons that he turned against their own sons and daughters after slaughtering tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers on the battlefield. Now, mycoplasma has been a long-time favorite of the bioweaponeers. Like brucellosis, it's a stealth weapon. That is, there's no inflammatory antibody response that a doctor can recognize once it's been genetically engineered. They've been playing with it since the 1970s when U.S. Marines and Air Force personnel were tested with mycoplasma, and guess what? Many of them contracted chronic fatigue and multiple sclerosis. Just around that time, 42 inmates at the Huntsville prison died after experiments with an aerosol, air-delivered mycoplasma, and brucellosis were given to them along with a few dollars. But what the experimenters didn't expect was that 231 nearby residents in that town would be stricken with chronic fatigue, multiple sclerosis, lupus, cancer, meningitis, and Epstein-Barr after that experiment. The Iraqis were also very interested in the mycoplasma. So we have a new breed of stealth viruses among us, thanks to the military genetic engineers. Dr. Martin at the Center for Complex Infectious Diseases has found in a chronic fatigue patient a brand new life form. He calls it bacteria, part virus, part bacteria, part fungus. It seems to be able to change from one to the other. Symptoms are severe headaches and joint pain. So we have chemical spraying. We have widespread illness that has not been identified by doctors or hospitals. We have a lot of questions, and we have a few answers here. And I'll say right now that we appear to have two programs at work. We have the high-level spraying that we just saw the slide, and we've seen over this city as recently as today. And also we have something else going on, a low-level spraying involving helicopters and, more often, C-130 Hercules-type aircraft. And last summer I was in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, up in the mountains, a little resort community. I've just given some presentations across the southern and western United States. I was trying to relax, and I was walking across the main street in Pagosa Springs, and I just stood shocked as I saw a C-130 glide down over the town, throttled back, silent, right over this town, and spray, and then up and away. Well, this low-level spraying gave us our first breakthroughs in this case. And I'd like to show you just two more slides very quickly. Very lucky to have this. And these slides illustrate the brown gel that has been dropped in communities here in Canada, the United States, and England. This sample came from the central United States, November 1999. November 1999. And we were able to match it with a very similar sample sprayed a year previously from a low-flying aircraft in Pennsylvania. And eyewitnesses at the time thought the aircraft would hit the roof of the house it was spraying. And they had noticed tic-tac-toe and what they called weird designs in the sky. This is just one section of a garage that's aluminum siding there that was splattered top and bottom and sides with this brown gel material. It was almost impossible to get this off even with pressure washer. This stuff is very, very tenacious. We think it's polymer coating. The first incident that received widespread publicity of the brown gel was, of course, Oakville, Washington, in August 1994. This is a little town, 665 people, about 80 miles southwest of Seattle. And that month, that town was covered during a rainstorm with brown gel, and virtually every person in that town became very ill with what residents told me was a really hard flu that lasted from 7 weeks to 2 or 3 months. Cats died, people became dizzy, fell down, were hospitalized. And the state health department stepped in and analyzed this material, and they found that this goo was alive. They found human white blood cells. They found a Pseudomonas fluorescens, which will give you very, very severe upper respiratory problems. And they found an Enterobacter bacteria as well. And that was confirmed by a second lab. What they didn't find out is where it came from and why the aircraft were dropping it on this population. But we do have pattern and precedent here. We have some 50 years of biological experimentation on the people of this country and the United States and England, testing various biological warfare stimulants that, don't worry, won't hurt anyone, but in fact did hurt a lot of people who were susceptible. From San Francisco to New York City, Winnipeg in particular, 2 million people exposed in England. They used ships and they used spray-equipped aircraft to deliver serratia marcescens, zinc cadmium sulfate, a known carcinogen by the way, and other material that would show up very quickly in their test to test dispersal rates and infection rates in the population. And the idea was if you made people sick enough to report to their doctor for the hospital, you could track the efficiency of these weapons on your own population. Oh, this is legal, by the way, at least in the United States. Section 1520 says it's okay for the Department of Defense to test chemical and biological weapons on the population as long as it's for research purposes. But in November '87, that law was amended and now reads 30 days advance notice must be given to Congress, and any human subject subjected to these tests must be notified in advance. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't received any notification by phone or mail that I'm about to be and have been experimented on.
So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. As always, please help keep this show on air by letting your cable company know you're watching. Or better yet, tell them what you think of the show. They transcribe every one of your calls and pass them on to us. We'd love to hear what you think about chemtrails. Next week, we'll hear more from William Thomas on chemtrails, including his notion as to why they exist. See you next week. Goodbye for now.
I'll say categorically, as a researcher and a person who's been writing about health for many years, that if we look behind the illnesses afflicting us now that are putting people in hospital, this flu-like illness, we are going to find fungus among us. Okay, treatment. We want to be alkaline. Fungal infections further acidify our blood with their byproducts. If our bloodstream is alkaline, if we eat that green leafy stuff and avoid the fun foods, my primary supplement is cayenne. Cayenne. Heat up your blood. Cayenne and ginger and garlic and miso and shiitake, but cayenne. And also oxygenate your blood with liquid oxygen supplements or exercise. Very important. We can knock out these fungal infections. Are those deaths that have been so often linked to this spraying intentional? Are they really trying to do us in? Or are they an unfortunate and unintentional byproduct of a program that is seen to have overriding national security implications in terms of global warming? Or are the people behind this program getting two for the price of one?
Never stop to wonder when watching my TV why we who do the work are so seldom seen. Now I'm wondering why we're blacked out or portrayed as troublemakers or always in the background when on screen. Working TV. Now we're on screen.
Welcome to Working TV. I'm Libby Davies. This week we continue with week 2 of the presentation on chemtrails by journalist William Thomas. According to Thomas, these chemtrails are the bizarre cloud-like trails left from the systematic spraying of chemicals over our cities and towns. Chemtrails look much like the contrails left by jet aircraft, but they don't dissipate in less than a minute as contrails do. In fact, they hang about for some time, slowly dissipating, and are often sprayed in crisscross or X patterns. Many of you claim to have seen, photographed, or videotaped these chemtrails, yet Transport Canada and the mainstream media won't even acknowledge they exist. That's because, according to Thomas, they are part of some kind of sinister plot to both control the weather and to cull our populations. This may sound like yet another nutty conspiracy theory. We're not so sure. At least we think Thomas deserves a listen. You decide. Here now, continued from last week, is part 2 of Chemtrails.
Working TV.
Now, I've been an environmental journalist for some 10 years. I attend conferences, I talk to scientists, and I keep up to speed on what is happening to this planet. I talk to advisors to this government, scientific advisors, and they are unanimous in calling what is happening to our atmosphere a global emergency. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a scam. This is actually happening. Poles are melting at an unprecedented rate. In the Arctic to the north of it, at such a rate, in fact, that the cold water now entering the North Atlantic is intersecting the North Atlantic conveyor, bringing warm water and nutrients up from the tropics and cooling that and slowing down this conveyor. And this is the conveyor that moderates climate across England and Europe. And you saw the huge windstorms and rainstorms this year, all the trees knocked down in France, the superstorms they're calling them. And we're seeing more and more of these superstorms. We're seeing rainfall patterns change, droughts, floods, tornadoes in winter. And it's the insurance company, not the environmentalists, that are pushing governments to act. The insurers are panicked. We're talking an industry even bigger than the arms industry and the fossil fuel mafia on this planet. They are very concerned that an unstable climate may destroy the insurance industry and take down the banks that back them. Insured losses were up 10 times from 83 to 92, and that was just the beginning. Lloyd's of London has lost $11 billion in 4 years, and I don't believe they're going to be able to sustain those kind of losses. Hurricane Andrew alone cost $15.5 billion to insurers, and now they're saying catastrophic losses from climatic extremes will total $30 billion a year, here on out. At the same time, we have a real emergency with the shredding ozone layer that protects our spaceship Earth from solar radiation. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has revised its estimate of skin cancer deaths from 9,300 to 200,000 over the next 50 years. Now, in August 1998, there was an international seminar on planetary emergencies. And Edward Teller took an idea, first proposed in 1979 by the renowned physicist Freeman Dyson, who proposed that we insert sunlight-reflecting particles to deflect solar radiation and cool the planet. This wasn't just an idle theory, because when El Chicon erupted, the resulting fallout from that volcano slowed the global warming trend 25% and gave the people saying, well, there's really nothing to this global warming, quite a lot of ammunition for a year or two. So at that conference on planetary emergencies, when Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, stood up, he proposed a similar sunscreen. And he said, if we can block 1% of incoming solar radiation, reflect it back into space, we will neutralize global warming. I have some very good researchers working for me, and they have very recently come up with a paper, a study done at the request of the U.S. government by the Lawrence Livermore Lab, the national laboratory in the United States. And they looked at this and they said, we can do this. It will cost us $1 billion a year. And that's 1% of the $100 billion a year it will cost our economy if we have to curtail fossil fuel use back to 1990 levels to slow global warming. Oh, sure, we can go to the solar age and alternative technologies that you know and I know are available. And of course, the oil cartel doesn't want us to do that. So here's an idea. We spray this sunscreen, we cool the planet slightly, and we can go on burning fossil fuels, and the corporations can go on making their profits. An environmental consultant named Mike Castle, who consults the U.S. government and other corporations in the United States, got in touch with me and thought, maybe this is what's going on. And then he discovered a patent actually taken out and awarded to one of the big aerospace defense contractors in the United States, Hughes Aerospace. Patent 1990000513145. Stratospheric well-back seating for reduction of global warming. A process to reflect infrared energy back into space. And this patent called for chemicals to be sprayed into the greenhouse gas layer, wait for this, 22,000 feet and higher. What were they going to spray? Oxides of metal. Which oxide? Aluminum oxide. Now you're saying, well, that's a heck of a lot of airplanes flying a lot of missions to spray that kind of material. So we turned to the United States Air Force, and you know what I found? They happen to own over 800 tanker aircraft, KC-135 and KC-10 aircraft. Exactly the plane that we have positively identified in hundreds of photographs and miles of videotape as the aircraft spraying these chemtrails. So could this really be happening? I mean, we have the study, we have the airplanes, we have the money, we have the patent, and we have the primary ingredient, aluminum. Well, we also have scientific proof. Because the people of Espanola, Ontario did not sit by and take the spraying in their community and resulting sickness among their families and children lying down. This is an Ojibwe community, about 80 miles to the west of Sudbury, Ontario. And in March last year, they began noticing these jets flying these crisscross patterns overhead, and they came down with joint pain and stiffness, often on the left side of their bodies, extreme upper respiratory problems, gastrointestinal problems, illness throughout the community. And then they saw low-flying aircraft come over, C-130s, spraying a red powderish material. My colleague went up there at that time and collected a sample just after the latest incident. We had it tested. Hundreds and hundreds of pathogenic molds and fungi in that spray, that low-level spray. But what about the higher-level spray? The people of Espanola raised such a ruckus that the Ministry of Environment Ontario was forced to get involved, and they ran tests on rainwater following the heavy spray days. And guess what they found? They found carbon black, which the United States Air Force says they use for weather modification. They found hundreds of molds, fungi, but most of what they found was aluminum. 7 times the safe levels. Aluminum at levels the North Lab said would kill fish. We have the lab tests, we have the study. It matches the Hughes patent. It matches what Edward Teller and Freeman Dyson and others were calling for. And it certainly looks to me tonight that what we are seeing is an attempt, a desperate attempt, at atmospheric modification. But weather is also being modified. We ask the United States, what the heck's going on? And they say, here's our report, Owning the Weather, 2025.
I'm Noam Chomsky. You're watching Working TV on cable.
As yet, my researchers and I have found absolutely no indication that the pathogens that are turning up in the gel samples, the cobweb material, have anything whatsoever to do with weather or environmental modification. There seems to be a second program at work here. In January of this year, there was a high-level summit conference. You may not have read about it in the local newspapers or heard about it on the CBC for some reason or other. This was a conference on the changing demographics on this planet, the aging population, and its threat to corporate profits and to defense budgets in particular. Then we have the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank representatives were there, very high-level people, and they were discussing what in the world are we going to do with the aging population. At least those are the words they used. Other words that have been used in the past are useless eaters. People who become elderly and no longer contribute monetarily to society and become a burden on society in terms of social assistance and especially Medicare. And as that becomes the preponderance in our population, there is a lot of concern among corporations in particular about their bottom line. The eugenics movement got its start in 1907 in the United States when the first eugenics law was passed there. And by 1944, 40,000 so-called insane or feeble-minded people had been forcibly sterilized. Another 22,000 by as recently as 1963. Now, in 1920, the Rockefeller Foundation, who became a principal promoter of the population, called for the mass sterilization and elimination of minority populations in the United States. And to head their program, they chose the fascists Ernest Rudin and Franz Kallman. Of course, it was Rockefeller Standard Oil that got together with I.G. Farben during that war. It became virtually the same corporation. It was Farben who made the nerve gas that killed more than 6 million Jewish people. Rudin himself went on to become part of the Nazi state and became president of the Worldwide Eugenics Federation. His sterilization law was adapted by the United States as law in July 1933 as a model with Hitler's signature attached. Kallman went on to head the American Society of Human Genetics, the Human Genome Project you've been hearing so much about recently. If you haven't heard about its Nazi antecedents. That's a $3 billion effort, of course, to map DNA by the year 2003, and they're well on their way. That's going to be pretty nifty because apparently we'll be able to identify genetically caused diseases, go in there and tinker around and eliminate those diseases. What they're not stressing in the news reports is that we'll also be able to identify race-specific diseases so that we can attack specific populations of people with diseases that will only kill them. In the 1950s, the U.S. eugenics movement moved literally into Rockefeller's family offices. Lawrence Rockefeller became head of the New York City Blood Council and then International Blood Banking. These are the eugenics people. 1960s, General William Draper. He supplied credit to the Nazis during World War II, and now he started the Draper Fund. The Vietnam generals we've all heard about, Maxwell Taylor, William Westmoreland, who headed that genocide and dioxin defoliation campaign in Vietnam. They were members of the Population Crisis Committee of the William Draper Fund. In 1964, the former commanding general, U.S. Army Chemical Corps, listed bioweapons favored by the U.S. military. There's a long list. I won't go into it, but let's note brucellosis, influenza, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Congressional investigations in 1977 and 1994 documented 50 years of biowarfare experimentations I mentioned earlier. 1969, a man named George Bush, son of eugenics advocate and Nazi bankroller Prescott Bush, this is all documented, by the way, chaired a committee urging world population control. Just 1 year later, Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor to President Nixon, issued National Security Memorandum 200 calling for a reduction of the populations of the lesser developed countries, that is the growth rate, by half. By half. He said we have to depopulate 14 countries or the U.S. will face a crisis worse than nuclear war. Kissinger said we can decrease the birth rate or increase the death rate. It's too bad he said we can't use nuclear weapons. It's a little obvious, but we have something even better. In fact, it was Kissinger who took the U.S. biowarfare program underground when Nixon publicly outlawed it and declared the U.S. was getting out of the biowarfare business. Kissinger made sure that program continued. There was another national security advisor to Nixon at the very same time. His name was Roy Ash. He's the president of Lytton Bionetics. And anyone who's reading Len Horowitz's excellent books, AIDS and Ebola and Healing Codes for the Biological Apocalypse, will be running into this name, Lytton Bionetics. And they were tasked with developing immune systems destroyers and cancer agents. They were the head of all experiments at Fort Detrick, and they were in charge of all monkey cultures and viruses in the United States. Lytton Bionetics, Roy Ash, National Security Advisor to the United States government. Let's get back to Mr. Kissinger in 1969, what a year that was. Because during that year, in the closed-door sessions for defense appropriations hearing, Dr. MacArthur stood up and said, secretly, after 24 years of biological warfare research that was started, by the way, with the first head of that program, George Merck, the founder of Merck Pharmaceutical Company, also heavy funders of world depopulation. 24 years of biological warfare research, 76 biological warfare labs, $31 million, a lot of money in those days, that year, for the heinous weapons. He said, let's add $10 million more to the pot, and we will develop the ultimate stealth weapon, a synthetic bioagent for which no natural immunity exists. He told the Congressional Committee, we'll probably have to deliver these as a primary aerosol through the air, and will infect people inhaling it. Now, he said this can be incapacitating or lethal, depending on what brew we use and the victim's general health. Oh, he said we might have a problem. Some people might think this is genocidal. We might have a publicity problem, but we can do the job. That money was awarded. The work did go forward. And an immunodeficiency disease was perfected at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And it was tested at the Tahoe Truckee High School. And 7 of the 8 young victims there developed chronic fatigue. Now, in 1970, Robert Gallo synthesized an AIDS-like virus under this program. And 2 years later, the WHO said the best way to test these new viruses is in vaccines, particularly among siblings. And isn't it interesting that in 1977, 100 million Africans were inoculated by the WHO, who set up a very high-tech lab near Angola in the middle of the jungle, and out of the goodness of their hearts, vaccinated these folks for smallpox, for an epidemic of smallpox. But there was no epidemic of smallpox. And they contracted AIDS. A year later, the hepatitis B vaccine was given to gays in the United States in 7 major cities. And you know what happened? AIDS broke out in those cities and only those cities. And I mentioned the International Summit on Aging and the Implications for Business. Did I mention that today all 14 countries cited by Kissinger in that Memorandum 200 now have the AIDS epidemic? 5,000 people a day are dying in Africa, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, which predicts that AIDS will be bigger in Asia even than Africa. Talking to nurses across the United States, anecdotally, we have an increase in the death rate among the elderly in hospital wards of roughly 4, 5, 6% following this chemtrail attack on our cities and communities. A number that is not going to leave bodies piled in the streets. We had a few incidents there in England. We had to bring some trucks in and haul them away, get them out of sight. But this is a significant number over time, and it climbs to 10%. That's a dictionary definition of a decimation of a population. In fact, Pope John Paul has come out with an encyclical railing against what he calls the culture of death in Western nations. That he says are deliberately killing their elderly, whom they see as burdens on society. So I guess if it's good enough for the Pope, it's good enough for me And we have a real problem here, folks. Are those deaths that have been so often linked to this spraying intentional? Are they really trying to do us in? Or are they an unfortunate and unintentional byproduct of a program that is seen to have overriding national security implications in terms of global warming? Or are the people behind this program getting two for the price of one? I'll just say this, that when you institute a program of mass spraying across the populations of the United States, Canada, England, Germany, as recently as a week ago, Holland, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, and at the same time you know that people are being hospitalized, according to U.S. news sources, by the tens of millions in the United States, and you know your death rate is up in epidemic proportions for 19 of 20 weeks, and you continue to spray, I call that deliberate. What in the world can we do? We have been virtually disempowered by a political process that does not answer to the public, by politicians who do not hold themselves accountable to anyone, not even God, and God help them. Thanks to the good people of Espanola, there is something we can do, and I urge all of you to do this and contact your friends and get onto your MP and demand and insistently demand and persistently insist that the people of Espanola receive a response to their petition to Parliament in Ottawa. They were promised a response from Ministry of Defense. That was about 5 months ago. And we want a response to them because in so doing, we will have a response to the inhabitants of this city and region. And I urge you, get on the fax, get on the phone, and don't stop until the people of Espanola have an answer. Until they have the truth, and we have the truth, and we have some accountability at last. Secondly, get on the phone, call the Vancouver Sun, my former employer, Vancouver Province, the CBC. Again, they've interviewed me at length, never ran the tape. And say, you heard this guy talking, and he has some very disturbing photographs and even more disturbing things to say. And he's a journalist. He's won awards. He doesn't appear to be too crazy. And heck, I've seen it myself. Tell them, why aren't you reporting this? And don't stop until they do. Because once someone in the mainstream media picks up this story, the others will have to follow. It's the herd instinct. No one wants to be scooped.
So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. As always, please help keep this show on air by letting your cable company know that you're watching. Or better yet, tell them what you think of the show. They transcribe every one of your calls and pass them on to us. We'd love to hear what you think about chemtrails. Next week, we'll be on holiday, so we'll air a rerun of one of our favorite shows from 1999. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more new programming. Check our website for details. See you in 2 weeks. Bye for now.
Very, very important that we apply public pressure here. Very important that we take our power back, and it's very important to understand, though we've heard a lot of frightening things tonight, biological weapons, bullets and bombs and planes and money, that's not power. That has nothing to do with power. The real power is here. It's all around us. And if we align to it, if we pray for it, if we invite it into our lives, there is nothing that can stop it and nothing that can stop the truth. And the one thing the people responsible for this are afraid of the most, and the one thing they cannot counteract with all the weapons and money at their command, is the truth. And the kind of power I'm talking about, which is the real power, will triumph in the end. Because evil of this magnitude always fails of its own accord, of its own contradiction, of its very evilness.